no matter what Jay Powell and his kind of band of merry men and women say about how we don't feel that we've created any wealth inequality, it's utter bullshit. Everybody looking at this can see exactly what you've done. It's a very short series of dots to join to prove that your monetary policy has led to stark wage disparity, to stark wealth disparity. The rich have gotten wholly richer. The poor have gotten far worse off. And for what?
Hey everyone, you're listening to On the Margin. I am your host, Michael Ippolito, and today we're going to be talking to Grant Williams, who's one of the original co-founders at Real Vision and currently runs Things That Make You Go, We cover a lot of really great macro-focused content in this conversation, ranging from Grant's early investing experience to what he thinks about central bank and the end game for money printing. We talk about his opinions on gold and Bitcoin. And finally, we talk about his framework for the fourth turning and some of the problems that America is facing as a nation, and just the general trend of people moving away from institutions and the impact that's having not just on markets, but on everyone's life. If you're listening to us on Apple, please make sure to give us a rating and a review. If you're listening on YouTube or Spotify, just hit that subscribe button. All right, here's the show. Mr. Grant Williams, welcome to On the Margin. I'm so excited to have you as a guest.
Hey, Michael, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as well. I feel like I've heard you interview so many folks at this point. It's great to get you kind of on the other side of the mic, so to speak.
Right, well, listen, so let's say that at the end of it, before the beginning. There's a good reason why I sit in the other chair most of the time.
Yeah, I know. Find some wood to knock on, right? Well, look, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today. I'd love to get into a lot of the stuff that you're working on right now, but I've heard you interview so many financial luminaries at this point. I would actually love you to give an overview of your own investing history and how you came to be interested in markets and investing in the first place.
Yeah, sure. It was something that I was interested in at a very young age. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew what I wanted to be because I had a very cool uncle who was. It turned out to be a foreign exchange trader. I didn't know what that was, but I wanted to be like him. So I decided that literally at the age of 8 or 9 that I wanted to be a foreign exchange trader. And so once I found out what that was, I realized it was the last thing I wanted to be. So I stayed as far away from foreign exchange as I possibly could. But
probably wise.
Yeah, but that was literally the genesis of it. And I just I was interested in finance. I was interested in that kind of world. My father worked for a small American merchant bank, so I was kind of involved or immersed in finance to some degree through him. But it was just something that I was interested in. I fell into. Luckily, I got offered a job right out of high school, and I had an opportunity to go to university or take this job, and I realized that if I went to university 4 years later, I'd be trying to get the same job again. So I just thought, you know what? And back in the early to mid 1980s, you didn't need a college degree to get a job. Certainly in the UK. I mean, it was probably different in the US, but university was the exception rather than the norm. So I turned down the university and took the job, and have not spent one day regretting it ever since. And that was July 1985. I started work, and I had a job in the settlements department of a Japanese warrant trading business for a merchant bank called Robert Fleming & Co., long since swallowed up by JP Morgan, sadly. And they had a joint venture out in Asia with Jardine Matheson called Jardine Fleming. So I spent a couple of years in London, and really by being in the right place at the right time, managed to get myself a job on the trading desk within a year of starting. And was thrown in the deep end, had no idea what I was really doing, to be honest with you, and was learning the hard way every single day. And then Black Monday came along, which took me completely by surprise.
Must have been a ton of fun.
Well, yeah, it wasn't at the time, I can assure you. It was just it was shocking. I mean, it really was shocking. And I've spoken about this often, but seeing a market lose 22% of its value in one trading session was really just unbelievable to me. That's the equivalent today of what? Where are we down? 8,000 on the Dow or something like that in a single day. So yeah, that was something, and I think that had a big influence on my mindset throughout the rest of my career. You know, knowing that was a real possibility. These were in the days before the Fed put, obviously, when we had free markets. But I was involved in the Japanese market. I spent a few years in Tokyo, right at the height of the madness on the Nikkei. So I was in Tokyo when the Nikkei hit 39,000 on New Year's Eve, 1989. So I had a good, close look at that. And again, was still really figuring everything out. I mean, I was surrounded by a lot of really smart people. And I was by far the youngest guy there. So I just kind of tried to learn as much as I could from everybody around me. And, I had some great mentors there and made some really good friends. I'm still friends with 30 plus years later. And then went back to London for a brief period. After that, ended up in the US. So I was in the US for the bursting of the Nasdaq bubble. So again, I saw that up close in the last few months of its rise. And then went back to Asia and spent some time in Hong Kong, spent some time in Singapore, some time in Sydney, but always on the trading side for investment banks. And then ended up working in Singapore for a good friend of mine at a hedge fund, Vulpes Investment, for Steve Diggle. And again, learned so much more in those 3 or 4 years that I spent with Steve. It was another much steeper learning curve, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And then Real Vision kind of happened, and was Steve and I were going to go and raise another fund, and I had this itch that I wanted to scratch, and I realized that I couldn't do both. You can't manage people's money and do something else. It just wasn't the right thing to do. And Steve was fantastic. He said, "Look, I get it. If you want to go and do that, go. And if it doesn't work out, come back." But he was incredibly supportive and has been from that day to this. And so I just kind of went off on that tangent, followed that path for the next 5 or 6 years, and it opened up a whole new world of possibilities to me. A completely different career, completely different set of skills, none of which I had, for sure. And again, kind of more learning on the fly. But I've enjoyed every minute of it. I've been very fortunate. I've enjoyed every phase of my career tremendously. I knew going into my first job, very, very soon after I started work at Fleming's in '85, I knew that this was going to be the best job I'd ever had. It was a completely different time, and it was. That was just a real highlight for me. But the people I've gotten to meet and the lessons I've learned in these last sort of 6 or 7 years while I've been on the Real Vision journey and beyond have just been life-changing for me. I mean, I've met some extraordinary people and made a lot of incredible friends, all of whom have helped me in more ways than I can ever repay. So I'm hugely grateful to everybody that has taught me what they've taught me in the last 6 or 7 years, because it's been phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a couple of specific experiences during your time as an investor. One, during Black Monday, the market crashed back in '87, and then also kind of your experience in the Nikkei, which was one of the largest, most significant bubbles of all time, and also the dot-com bubble. Mm-hmm. How have those experiences colored the way you approach markets and investing?
Well, look, I mean, there are plenty of people out there who would say they've made me a perma bear. I don't believe that to be the case.
You're not a perma bear. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
You got a measured approach.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But
you're pragmatic.
Thank you.
Pragmatic bear.
I prefer that. But it's funny because I think I've always been a believer that your formative years in the business will colour your career, and obviously we have no control over the environment we inherit. And so I inherited a crazy bull market, and the biggest percentage drop in markets in our lifetimes. I had both of those as formative experiences. So for me, that was great, because even if I didn't realize it at the time, it helped me understand what speculative success looks like, and it helped me understand the ultimate downside of that once it goes too far. And I think having both those experiences early in my career was a huge advantage for me. And as I say, I hold to the belief that avoiding big drawdowns like we saw in '87 is the single most important thing to do if you're an investor. You can make money slowly, but if you lose it quickly, it takes you a long time to get it back. And so having seen those things, having watched and been completely caught up in the frenzy in '89, but with the memory of '87 still very fresh in my memory, was great, because I never really fully bought into the Japanese craziness. I always had at the back of my mind, this can go south in a hurry. So I would think in bull markets I'm never going to make as much money as the people who just go into it with abandon and just lever themselves up and put everything on and just ride it. I'm never going to make the same money as those guys. But I hope I'm never going to suffer the kind of pain that comes with being caught at the top, wildly long, hopelessly over optimistic, and nowhere near cautious enough. Because over time, I think by understanding risk and by constantly being aware of it and trying to mitigate it every day, for me, that's just the way I prefer to work. There'll be plenty of people that think that's crazy. You should be all in, and that's great. But everybody has to do this in the way that suits their personality, their temperament, their goals. That's why it's such a difficult thing when people ask for how do you do this? How do you do that? How do you manage this? We're all so different in what we want to try and protect against, and what we're happy throwing caution to the wind for. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. So I try not to offer people advice. I'm very happy to talk about what I do, and I'm very happy to kind of ask people to explain their process and explain their framework and how they think about things. But I've never really been one to ask people for stock tips. What should I buy, and what should I be long of, and what should I short, and that kind of stuff. Because I just think when you do that, if you don't have the same mindset as the person buying that share that they've told you to buy, you're going to be handling that position completely differently. And if that guy owns a certain stock with a very tight stop because he's long it, but he's cautious and he's nervous about it, and you just think, well, this is great, I'm going to buy that thing and watch it go up. You can have two people in exactly the same stock that have completely different experiences. And so for me, it's always been a question of understanding the hows and the whys and not the whats. I'm always asking people how they do things and why they do things. And I've never really been so interested in what they do, if that makes any sense. I just think that information is really a moment in time. The what is always temporal, whereas the hows and the whys have just a much longer shelf life and a much broader set of applications.
Absolutely. One question that I want to ask you is, you have been hosting this podcast for the last 9 months or so called The Endgame. You're actually hosting 3 separate podcasts. You're like the Energizer Bunny of content creation, but we'll get to that later. Endgame is, I got to be honest, it's one of my favorite. That's one I've just listened to many episodes over and over, and I've got some specific questions about your interview with Paul Singer, which was, I thought, phenomenal. But maybe just starting at a high level here, could you just explain the point of that podcast? What is the central question that you're asking?
Well, I think the way that came about is interesting because Bill Fleckenstein and I have been mates for a number of years, and our mutual friend Mark Cahodes basically got the two of us in a headlock and said, "You two guys need to do a podcast together." And it's saying no to Mark is a difficult thing to do, and so we both kind of thought, yeah, that'd be fun. And we didn't really know we didn't have an idea what the podcast was going to be about. But Bill and I have talked often and for many years about this idea about the end game and what it means. And I think by that, what we meant was the kind of end of the era of money printing. How does this end? How does the market, or to use Bill's excellent phrase, how does the bond market take the printing press away from central banks? And so that was kind of when we sat down and talked about what a podcast would be about. That was kind of the thing that we both landed on. Was like, let's explore this end game concept and see if other people think differently to us, and so that was kind of what we set out to do. And one of our very first guests, Mike Green, the very first thing he said was, of course there isn't an end game. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And it was at that point that I realized that what we were really trying to figure out was really more of a transition. It's how do we move from this investing environment that we have today to whatever comes next, because there will be a different paradigm that we have to invest in, because trees don't grow to the sky and money can't be free forever and interest rates can't stay low forever and debt can't build up indefinitely, right? There will be a reckoning. And at that point in time, everything will necessarily have to change. We'll go from low rates to high rates. We'll go from massive debt to people not wanting any debt. We've seen this many, many times throughout history. So it became really a question of, okay, what are the different threads to this, the current environment? What is the construct we're all investing in, and how do we transition from that to something else? Who knows what that may be? We don't know. What are the signs? What should we be looking for? What are the clues that change is at hand? And so that's kind of where we've really taken this thing, is talking to people about their views on what happens next, and some of them are macro focused and some of them are sector focused, but every single one of them has been fantastic. I mean, we've been incredibly fortunate, Bill and I, to have just the most amazing guests, all of whom have been in rare form when we've spoken to them, and given the two of us, to say nothing of the audience, lots to think about. And the series has really kind of taken on a life of its own, which is fabulous. But look, without these guys being willing to come on and share their experiences and share their wisdom and share their thoughts, it would just be Bill and I talking to each other, and nobody wants to listen to that. Even Bill and I probably.
Yeah, I listened to that episode with Mike Green a couple times, actually.
Yeah.
He had a big brain. Took a little while to digest everything that he was saying. And it reminded me of this quote. I don't know if you're a fan of Watchmen.
Do you know what? No, I tried to watch it when they did the HBO thing, and I couldn't get into it.
I thought it was so good. I didn't even like the original movie that I watched. I don't like Zack Snyder. I think he's single-handedly destroyed the DC entire. That's a whole different discussion for a different day. But I thought that was great. But there's this really good line at the end of the original Watchmen, which is this guy, spoiler alert, this guy Adrian does this horrible genocidal type thing, and it's to unite the different peoples of the world and get them all behind this thing, but he ends up killing about 3 million people. And he asks this guy at the end of the day, hey, was it all worth it? How does it all end? And this god, Dr. Manhattan, says nothing ever ends. Yeah. And I thought that was just such a great quote. And listening to Mike Green say that, I was like, man, I'm outing myself as a complete nerd here. But that's what it reminded me of. Listening to all of the episodes that you've put together, my framework that I think you're laying out is, it seems like we're kind of between a Scylla and a Charybdis type situation, where on the one side you have asset bubbles and inflation, and on the other side you risk huge deflation, right? And massive drops in the stock market, which would be really bad, obviously for the US, but also global economies. How do you think about kind of the transition or the risks that investors are facing today?
Well, look, I think at any point in time, there is always risk, always. And sometimes the risks are heightened, and sometimes they come out of the clear blue sky and you just don't see them coming. But yeah, look, I think right now that deflation inflation debate, which has been kind of raging for some time now, but it's not really been a debate, because it's been about a deflationary problem and an inflationary solution to it, which they've been singularly unable to create. So while it's been a debate, it really hasn't. It's not been which one are we going to get. It's been how do we kill one with the other. Now I think things have changed. I think we are now, and this is my big takeaway from the Endgame series so far, is that this inflation deflation debate is a decision that everybody has to think through very, very seriously, because it's if we do move from deflation to inflation, then everything changes. And so portfolios that have performed very well won't, and portfolios that have sucked will start to outperform again. And so you may need to shift your entire asset allocation based on the environment. And because inflation's essentially been absent for 40 years now, people make the assumption that it's not something we're ever going to have to deal with again, which is totally understandable. They have no experience of it. I was 12, 13 years old when inflation peaked in 1980. So I don't have any memory of inflation. I vaguely remember news headlines in the papers. I was familiar with the word. I didn't really know what it meant. But I having lived through the 70s in the UK, even as a kid, I remember the riots. I remember the strikes. I remember all that stuff. It's not. They're memories that I didn't have an understanding of what they all meant, but I remember the general environment really quite well. And that's not to say that that's where we're heading back to, but the same forces that caused that and created that environment are likely to be present again at some point in what's likely to be the not too distant future. So with that kind of understood, I then comes down to, from the investment perspective, to your time frame, purely and simply. Are you a trader? Are you trying to trade the turn in the tides from deflation to inflation? If that's the case, then you've probably got deflation as your main threat for the not for the foreseeable future. If you're trying to invest for the next 5 years, then it's probably still too early to start adjusting your portfolio to deal with inflation. Although I'm sure it'll behoove you to start thinking through what you need to do once the time comes when you think it's something you need to take action against. If, on the other hand, you're trying to invest for 10, 15, 20 years, a lifetime, then I don't think it's at all too soon to start readjusting your portfolio to be more inflation resistant. Because whilst I believe we could still have another deflationary gut punch headed our way, I suspect that will very quickly give way to inflation. And we may not get that deflationary gut punch. And look, there are so many smart people on both sides of this debate, a lot of whom we've talked to in the podcast. We had Lacey Hunt and Russell Napier back to back on the end game. Steph Pomboy and I talked to Dave Rosie on the Super Terrific Happy Hour. Each of them making wildly different cases, each of them ridiculously smart in their own way, and all of them offering very useful, very credible, and very valuable arguments. There is no right answer, but taking those inputs, Rosie makes a very, very strong case as to why we don't have to worry about inflation. And then you listen to Russell Napier, who has been a staunch deflationist for 20 years, explain why he believes that 4-5% inflation is imminent. And he makes, again, a very credible case. Lacey Hunt remains a deflationist. But all of these guys, the one thing they have in common is none of them are dumb. And they all think about this stuff a great deal, and that none of them are shooting from the hip. So what it tells you is, if you have guys with that level of intellect that disagree so strongly, that tells you that we are at a juncture where the waters are getting very, very choppy. And it tells me that I need to start thinking about what the future might hold and preparing for that if I believe it's the right thing to do. And that's what I have started to do. I think for me, with a 10-year view, I'm not prepared to back deflation for another 10 years. And so I'm very happy to start reconstructing my own portfolio to be more resistant to inflation than deflation.
If we're headed towards an inflationary environment, do you see financial oppression? And what I mean by financial oppression is sustained negative real yields. Do you see that happening in an inflationary environment.
Yeah, I can see that. Look, you have to remember that the position back in 1980, when we had this wild inflation, the Federal Reserve with Paul Volcker could put interest rates up close to 20%. Right? They had the ability to do that, to choke off inflation, and God bless Volcker, he did it. He had no bones about it. He did it. He at the time was demonized, later to be lionized, quite rightly. And he did it. But if you think about where we stand today, there is absolutely no way in the world that central banks can do that with interest rates, because the entire financial system, given the amount of debt that has built up, would utterly implode. Never mind 20% rates, try 5% rates. The whole thing is unsustainable at those levels. So whilst the problems are going to be of a very similar nature, the solutions to them are going to have to be markedly different, because they just don't have the one tool that they used to break the back of it back in 1980s, and they don't have it at their disposal anymore. So financial repression is an absolute given for me. There will be currency controls, capital controls. There will be they will try pegging the yield curve. They will do all kinds of dramatic and drastic things to try and stop inflation getting out of control, to try and stop, more importantly than inflation getting out of control, bond yields getting out of control. Because from where we are, it takes a very, very small move in the bond market to cause an awful lot of damage for people. And when you've got 1 in 5 S&P companies unable to finance their operations out of cash flow, and necessarily being forced to have to roll over debt to maintain solvency, that's a world of hurt waiting to happen. So the response to these natural forces is what worries me the most, because I think it will be the kind of things that you kind of imagine in your worst nightmare and think, no, there's no way they'd do that. I mean, how would they possibly get away with it? And I was talking to someone the other day, and when we were talking about it being a year since the pandemic started, and I said to him, look, if I'd have told you really how easy it would be to get several billion people to lock themselves inside their homes and do exactly as they're told, you'd have told me there's no way I can do that to all those people. And that's I'm not being a conspiracy theorist. I'm just saying it's a lot easier than you think for governments to mandate things for people to do, and people just do them. So they're going to be forced to take some dramatic measures. They are going to be confiscatory in nature, I suspect. They will try and keep the wheels on this thing, but there are going to be some very, very powerful natural forces desperately trying to pull this thing apart. And at that point, it becomes a contest between the forces of nature and the forces of elected and unelected officials of all kinds. And place your bets where you want, but ultimately, I just don't see the forces of nature succumbing to Jay Powell, Christine Lagarde, and a few politicians around the world.
So maybe this is a good point to transition into your perspective on gold, which I've heard you talk about. And there's one interview you did a while ago where you described the unique role that gold plays kind of at the heart of the financial system. And I know you've been a proponent of gold for a long period of time. So maybe just talk about how you think about that asset and the role that it would play in an environment of financial repression.
Yeah, there was a time in my life where I didn't care about gold. I didn't, I was aware of the gold price. If it moved, I didn't check it every day. I was aware of its role and its importance, but it didn't really. There was no need to own it. I didn't feel, and that for me changed around 2000 when the Fed did what they did to try and combat the bursting of the dot-com bubble, and at that point I started reading a lot more. History. I was always a history guy anyway, but I started reading a lot more history at that time, and monetary history, and trying to understand the role that gold had played throughout thousands of years of history. And it became clear to me that the only way forward for governments was really going to be currency debasement in the form of artificially low interest rates. The idea of printing money was was a vague one at that time. We hadn't foreseen QE, but if you'd read history, you understood where we were headed. And so at that point, I started to feel like I needed to own gold. It wasn't a trade. It was something I felt I needed to do to counteract the steps that were going to be taken by the fiscal and monetary authorities. And at the time, gold was trading in, I think, a low $300 range, and it just seemed wildly too low to me. And it was clear that was because it just was unloved, and I hadn't needed to own it or look at it for many years, and so no one else had either. So that I started buying gold. I think I paid $333 for my first ounce of gold, and I remember handing over physical currency. I wanted to pay for it in cash, and there was something about handing over some very familiar paper and being handed this coin that when you dropped it in your hand, it was meaningful. It's a strange thing, and if you haven't experienced it, you won't know. But to hand over money and to be given wealth is a very interesting feeling, because of the weight of gold, the density of it. It feels like it's worth something. And whether paper, fiat currency is just so familiar that you just don't think about it as you hand it over, it really felt to me like an unfair exchange. I felt like I was screwing the guy out of something by giving him this paper and being given this lump of metal. And that was a very interesting sensation for me. And from there, I've accumulated gold over the years and continue to do so. But it's never, when you ask about how I think about it, and I've talked about this a lot, so if I'm boring people, I apologize, but you asked the question, I'm just answering it. The last thing I care about is the price. People think I'm joking when I say I don't care about the price. I don't care about the price. It's not about that to me. I know that no matter where the gold price is trading over time, relative to other assets, it's going to preserve my purchasing power. And that's really all I care about. I just don't want my money being worth less because of inflation, because of governments, because of all the things that they are absolutely required to do to keep the system together. When a government says that we are going to target 2% inflation, they are telling you our aim is to reduce your purchasing power by 2% a year. And that compounds very, very quickly. So I don't think about the price. I look at gold as a liquidity reserve. I look at it as a monetary asset. And in terms of, when people talk about the price, I never think about the price level where I would sell my gold. I think about a point in time where I might decide that the gold I have in that safety deposit box, I would prefer to own that piece of land with it, or I'd prefer to own a property, or I'd prefer to own something else than the gold. And at that point, I will exchange the gold for that other asset, whatever it may be. It's not a $3,000 gold price. It's not a $5,000 gold price. It's, I have gold here in this safety deposit box that I can exchange for that, given where the relative price of the two are. There may well be a time when, and I hope the time comes, when I feel again that I don't need to own any gold. But that comes from a system that's been purged of debt. It comes from a system where governments are not on this reckless, hell-bent mission to just debase the currency out of necessity. And so when people get caught up in gold isn't doing what gold's supposed to do with all this stimulus checks going, it doesn't faze me in the slightest. I look at what equity markets are doing, and people will say, well, you're sitting there in gold, and you could have been participating in this crazy equity rally. And the simple truth is, since I started buying gold close to 20 years ago, with very little stress, because I'm not focusing on the price, I've outperformed the S&P 500 over that time handily. So I didn't have to suffer through the '08 drawdown and see these shares be illiquid. I could have sold my gold at any point during that meltdown. There was no impediment to selling your gold at the market price during the '08 meltdown. And even though gold fell, my purchasing power increased significantly, because gold, fell $100, $150, which was what 10, 15%, I think, at its maximum, the equity market fell 60%. And so people are saying, well, gold fell as well. Yeah, it did, but I could have still bought 3 times the units of the S&P with my gold that I could have done beforehand, even though the gold price had fallen. And that's really the important thing to understand, is it's not about the gold price. It's about what you can exchange that gold for. So, there will come a time, I'm sure, where I will happily exchange all my gold, and I may exchange it for the S&P 500. If that thing is once again like it was in the early 80s, trading at 6 times earnings and yielding 6% dividends, I would happily trade all my gold for an equity market that I could just buy and put away for 20 years and forget about. But we're nowhere near that yet, and we've got a long way to go before we get there, and the road from here to there is strewn with all kinds of bear traps and quicksand and all kinds of things. So I'm just very happy sitting in gold, and I'm very happy to let other people get rich by buying Bitcoin and suffering that kind of volatility. I mean, great. I'm very happy, everybody. For me, for the level of risk tolerance that I want to put up at 54 years old, it's wholly different, and I'm very, very comfortable holding gold.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned what you and Bill Fleckenstein call the B word, so I actually want to get into that a little bit. First of all, every time in the end game, when you said the Bitcoiners have stopped listening, I have kept listening. So I do want to collect some sort of trophy or something for that. I always keep listening through that. I'll wait for that to come in the mail. But, I listened, in preparation for this, to a talk that you had with Keith McCullough over at Hedgeye. And you were talking about this kind of binary attitude that is manifesting across the political spectrum, across the financial spectrum, and how Bitcoin epitomizes this binary polemical kind of view that seems to be very pervasive in the US today. And I'll be the first to say I completely agree with you. And I think a lot of what you see on Twitter and a lot of the public discourse is straight up counterproductive, I would say. But I think even just listening to how you described gold, saying things like, I don't care about the price and it's about protecting my purchasing power. People say that kind of stuff about Bitcoin as well, and sometimes that gets interpreted as that's a extreme sort of thing to say. And I'm going to give you my second nerdy. I'm going to out myself as a nerd for the second time on this podcast. But there's an episode of South Park. I don't know if you've ever watched that show.
I have. I used to watch it religiously. I haven't watched it for a long time,
satire.
But I used to watch it.
Great satire. Well, real life has become. It's hard to satirize what's going on right now. But there was a great episode. Character Cartman, he gets frozen in time. He wakes up, 1,000 years later. In the beginning of the episode, he's talking about these religious wars and how it's kind of silly where people fight over different religion. Wakes up 1,000 years later and people are still fighting these religious wars. And, you find out halfway through the episode that everyone's an atheist in the future. And what they're actually fighting about is the name of the Atheist League, the United Atheist Alliance.
Right.
And, when I listen to people who support gold or find value in the role that it plays in the financial system, and when I listen to what people who are supporters of Bitcoin talk about, it's like 90% of the way they're agreed, right? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
Problem everyone agrees on. It's just at the end, what's the right way to express that view where people disagree, I guess. But I'm totally right there with you in that I just think that it's really hard to have a non-emotional conversation.
Well, the sad truth of it is there's a coda to that statement where it's hard to have a sensible conversation in public, right? That's the problem, because in private I've had some wonderful conversations with people about Bitcoin, and I've learned an enormous amount about it, and as you said, I absolutely understand the case for Bitcoin. I completely understand it. It's not, and I think anyone who is an advocate of gold completely understands it. Now, there will be some gold proponents who dislike the limelight that Bitcoin is taking from them, who dislike intensely the way Bitcoin is performing because they feel like gold should be performing that way and they're jealous or whatever. I get it. This is all human emotion. But the simple truth is that, as you say, the two, let's call them ideologies for want of a less inflammatory word, are incredibly closely aligned. The difference, I think, is that no matter what anybody says, Bitcoin, because of its trajectory, has become about the price. And even the staunchest, most hardcore Bitcoin guys who are real thought leaders in the space, you find them on Twitter marking off 53,000, 54,000, 55,000, right? And that doesn't fit I think the narrative you're trying to convey. If you genuinely believe in Bitcoin as the future and you believe in it to do all the things you believe it's going to do, whether it's 53,000 or 54,000 makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. It doesn't make any difference, particularly if you're a hodler. You're never going to sell it anyway. So why does 54,000? Well, I'll tell you why 54,000 matters and 55,000, because that's a way to pull more people into this thing, right? It's the same with gold. When it goes through 2,000 and all the gold guys come out and start saying 2,000, here we go, and 2,500 next and 3,000 next. That's how you're going to pull more people in who aren't necessarily ideologues in terms of Bitcoin or gold, but they are susceptible to that base human emotion of greed. And you want more people in your tribe. You want more people buying gold. You want more people buying Bitcoin. I get it, but I think when you try and have these conversations in public, everybody gets very defensive and everybody feels like they're being attacked. And the best form of defense is attack. And so everybody puffs their chest out on Twitter, and ad hominem attacks start flying out, and and it's such a shame because as you say, the two camps are very, very close in ideology. They just have their own horse in the race, and they don't want to back the other guy's horse, which is fine. But that problem with having a sensible, reasoned, balanced discussion about Bitcoin, the pros and cons, and I was very fortunate, thanks to Mike Green and Nick Carter, I was able to have a sensible debate about Bitcoin that was polite and respectful, and I thought both guys accredited themselves really, really well.
Agreed.
And it was refreshing to be able to listen to that and not get into the name calling and all that, because it's just pointless, right? But in public, people, if they get challenged, they want to respond to that challenge, and so things escalate very, very quickly, and that's not just a Bitcoin gold thing. That's a Republican Democrat thing. That's a boomer millennial thing. That's a 1%, 99% thing. It's just this divisiveness that's all around us right now. And again, I've spoken about this a lot lately, but the divide, people think of it on a horizontal scale. They think this is a left and right problem. And if we divide people left and right, we put a line down the middle, there's where the two sides are drawn. But the reality of it is this is a vertical struggle. Whichever way you look at it, right? If you cut left and right, Republican, Democrat, on each side, you've got rich and poor, you've got old and young, you've got boomers, millennials, you've got these vertical struggles. And that's where the real conflict is here. That's where the problems lie because of the last 10, 12 years of monetary policy. No matter what Jay Powell and his kind of band of merry men and women say about how we don't feel that we've created any wealth inequality, it's utter bullshit. Everybody looking at this can see exactly what you've done. It's a very short series of dots to join to prove that monetary policy has led to stark wage disparity, to stark wealth disparity. The rich have gotten wholly richer. The poor have gotten far worse off. And for what? To try and keep the system together, right? All this has been done to keep the system together, with the idea being that by keeping the system together, it's better for everybody. Well, it's not. If the system burned to the ground in '08, if all the banks had gone, we keep hearing about, oh my God, you have no idea what would have happened if we hadn't stepped in and done what we'd done. We don't, and there's never a counterfactual. But can you tell me that after an incredibly tough period for everybody, that the system wouldn't have been reset in a much fairer way? Because I would argue that's absolutely what would happen. I would have think that a lot of very, very wealthy people would have gotten a lot less wealthy in a very short period of time. And that wealth, paper-based though it was, would have just gone away. And yes, it would have been an incredibly tough adjustment period. But look at COVID, right? The world came together and came up with a solution to a problem it was facing, the likes of which it hadn't faced in 100 years. Now, you can believe in the virus or not believe in the virus. It doesn't matter. The world was faced with a problem. The world came together, took drastic measures, and yes, there was the entire global economy came to a halt, and unemployment shot through the roof in just about every country on earth. But guess what? Here we are a year later, and we've gotten through that. Are you telling me that's worse than had they allowed Goldman Sachs to go under, or they'd allowed Merrill Lynch to go under? Are you telling me this is worse? We'll never know. But I think what we can safely assume is that the people who made those decisions were absolutely the people who stood to benefit from the actions that were taken the most, and they did. So this vertical conflict that we are experiencing right now, so much of it stems from that. And I don't think anybody that pays attention doesn't understand that, and that includes every single employee at the Federal Reserve. But of course, there's absolutely no way they can come out and say, yeah, well, what we've done has exacerbated the wealth divide. There's no way they could admit to that. And so they won't. And they'll keep doing what they're doing. They'll keep trying to, quote unquote, keep the system together at the expense of the very people that they're purporting to try and save. It's egregious.
So it seems sometimes like the cleanest framework to describe a lot of what we have talked about during this podcast, but a lot of what you just kind of alluded to, is this fourth turning framework around the abandoning of different institutions. And you see it kind of across financial institutions. There's a mistrust in banks. There's a mistrust in political institutions like governments. And there's a mistrust in the media, right? You kind of see it across this broad swath of different institutions. And in some sense, that's quite worrying. Do you agree with that framework? Or what's your thought on that kind of this whole fourth turning transition of institutions?
Well, again, I absolutely subscribe to that theory, and I've spent a lot of time talking with my buddy Neil Howe about this, and it's a book that if anyone listening to this hasn't read it, they ought to read it. It's a fantastic book, and it really helps you understand so many different dynamics, I think. But for me, the important thing to understand is that the fourth turning is just that. It's a turning, and it leads to a first turning, and this is a cycle that's repeated throughout history. And I think whenever you're in a fourth turning, that's the dark part of the cycle, right? And so it's natural to be afraid in the dark. It's natural to be concerned about the outcomes. But mankind has survived plenty of fourth turnings in the past, and will survive this one. It's uncomfortable when, particularly at an institutional level, when there is an abandoning of institutions, because institutions in good times make us feel safe. So when they start to crumble and they start to be kind of shown up to either no longer be fit for purpose or never were in the first place, it's uncomfortable, and we're all shaken to our foundations by it. And it leads to turmoil, and it leads to conflict, it leads to all the things we're seeing. But look, we're seeing those now. The fourth turning, when you read about these previous fourth turnings, just spend some time thinking about, well, what were the people in those fourth turnings? How were they feeling at the time? Now, many of them have been characterized by war, so that's a wholly different thing. But from a social strife point of view, do you think they felt any different to the way we do now? I'm sure they didn't. It's a moment in time that feels very scary, that feels uncomfortable, where things seem out of control. But we will look back on this fourth turning in times to come and see it as a period in time. It's not a constant as it is to us every day when we wake up at the moment. Every day we live this right now. But at some point, that will fade. The system will reset, as it always has done, as it always has to do, and something will be born out of that. The big problem is what leads to that rebirth. Is it conflict, and if so, what kind of conflict are we talking about? Are we talking a World War II or a Civil War type conflict? Which again, it feels, for the first time in my lifetime, you kind of look at America and feel like if someone flashed me forward 100 years in the future and showed me a news clipping of 2025 and there was a civil war in the US, I wouldn't go, oh my God. I'd go, yeah, you kind of felt that was coming, and this is the first time it's felt like that in my lifetime. And of course, it always feels worse in the moment because you're scared of the unknown. But I've never had those kind of thoughts before in my lifetime. So I think we're in a fourth turning. And so being in the middle of it, you can't see the other side, and it feels like a hugely oppressive period of time that will go on for who knows how long. But mankind will survive, and mankind will get through that and find a new way and a new system under which to operate, and we'll thrive again. That's what we do. But it's just unfortunate that we have to live through this period. The boomer generation, God bless them, that they missed World War II. Certainly consciously, a lot of them were young kids there. They've lived through this phenomenal period of prosperity and wealth generation, and a lot of them are gonna exit stage left before we get to the meat of this. So what a great time to be alive. You just had to kind of avoid Vietnam, and which was really only a problem for Americans and a few Canadians and a couple of Aussies. And you were golden. But my kids' generation and my grandkids' generations are probably going to have to live through some real turmoil and some real struggle. But that's what the greatest generation did, right? They went through the Depression, they went through World War II. So it's kind of the generational lottery. Some people win it, some people don't. But right now we're at a point where you've got this transfer of power, which is probably overdue. The boomers never handed power to Gen X. My generation have never really had the reins of power because the boomers had it, and for obvious reasons, they're not going to relinquish it until they have to, whether that's by time running out finally or it being snatched from them by another generation. And that feels like where we are now. The millennials and Gen Z generations are keen to have that power to redistribute things, to make things fairer for themselves, as is perfectly understandable. So what does that transition of power look like? Is it peaceful over time at the ballot box, which would obviously be the most preferable way for it to happen, or is it Antifa? Is it QAnon? Is it all these kind of crazy factions that stir up some kind of rebellion that leads to a far more violent transfer of power? We don't know. My faith would be that it would be the former, and we will, I suspect, in the next midterms, we'll start to see a lot more younger congressmen and women, senators getting elected to office. And that, to me, is the sign that I'm looking for, that we will start to see a lot of these policies that start to favor the young and penalize the old and the wealthy, which is, I guess that's the circle of life, Hakuna Matata and all that. That's the way it should go, right? I mean, it's the way it should go. But when you look at just how wealthy the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks of the world have become in the last year, you realize that something is absolutely not right. When the world is struggling the way it's struggling, and these guys are making hundreds of billions of dollars just in the valuation of their stock, something is broken and it needs to be fixed.
Yeah. I think anyone with a view towards history could look at that disparity and predict there's not going to be a good outcome here, right? Like if you look back at times of historical unrest and strife, it is virtually almost always preceded by historic gaps in income inequality. It's just a tale as old as time. And for me, when I'm looking at, there are a lot of conflicts that are manifesting themselves in seemingly different ways, but I think it's all, you can trace it all back to the same issue, which is simple inequality. And there's only so long that that can go on. As the divide gets bigger and bigger, at a certain point, people just aren't going to put up with it. I feel like everything traces back to that one statistic. And I do think there will be, Ray Dalio talks about this a lot, some sort of redistribution, whether that be from the boomers to a younger generation or, across different racial or gender lines, whatever it is. It feels like we are headed towards a redistribution of wealth in some way.
I absolutely agree. And the interesting thing is, because of the debt levels in the world, the people who you would think at face value fall into the category of wealthy are not wealthy. There are a lot of people living in $5 million homes who have $4 million mortgages, right? Because money's so cheap to borrow. And if, as I suspect will be the case, there are kind of one-off wealth taxes on valuable houses, something that is simple to do because no one can move their property, but also plays very well politically. You start to say, well, if you've got a $5 million home, you can afford to pay a $200,000 tax, and so that's what we're going to make you do. And politically, that plays great. Yeah, stick it to those guys. If you've got a $5 million home, you can pay $200,000 into the kitty. Of course you can. If you've got a $5 million home with a $4 million mortgage on it, you cannot afford to pay $200,000. You just can't. And so the line of wealth has been blurred dramatically by debt. People who look wealthy and seem wealthy are not wealthy. They've borrowed an awful lot of money. The only way you can really redistribute this is to take it from people who physically have that wealth. And that is the Jeff Bezos, and it is the Elon Musk, and it is the Bill Gates. It's all these guys. It's all the people in private equity who've cashed out and made hundreds of millions of dollars. That's real wealth, right? And it's tangible wealth, and it's wealth that they can be forced to give up and still put a roof over their families' heads and put their kids through private school. But of course, they also have maximum lobbying power. They also have maximum influence. So it's one way or another, this is going to be a conflict because the people that have do not want to give up, and the people that have not want, and that's just the way it's going to be. You can place your bets on how you think it's going to go. It's not going to be a simple process of, hey, you guys have got a lot of money, can we have it? Yeah, sure. We've got too much money, here, have it. That's the one thing I guarantee you is not going to happen. Everything else is a conflict of some sort to be figured out.
Yeah. I've got one more question for you, and then I've impinged on your time long enough here. But you alluded to something back during the last fourth turning, right? So during the 30s in the United States, that there was a big confiscation of gold, right? I had to look this up because this number shocked me. Do you know how long it was illegal for U.S. citizens to own gold?
Oh yeah, like 40 odd years, right?
40 years.
Yeah.
That blew my mind. And it blew my mind how the government did it, which was they made every owner a forced seller at a price of $20 an ounce. Yep. And then they immediately repriced it to $35. So, I mean, that to me was unbelievable. I guess it shows you the kind of political will that must have been generated post Great Depression. But, to your point earlier, if you had asked the question, how easy would it be to get 7 billion people to lock themselves up? Well, in normal times, that would be impossible. But after periods of dislocation, that enables politicians to summon some amount of political will to do incredible things. And tying it all back to, I think, when I think about Bitcoin as well, I think one of the biggest worries that I have about it is government interference. And on that great debate that you hosted with Nick and Mike, you brought that question up, and I think Nick's response was something to the effect of, I would become a dissident if it was made illegal. And I was kind of thinking, I would not become a dissident because I love living in the United States, actually. And so I guess that's something that I worry about. Is that something that you think could potentially happen again with gold? I understand it was a very different situation back then, and we were on the gold standard, and that was interfering with the government's ability to finance itself and debase the fiat currency. Bit of a different situation than we have today. But Do you ever worry about these kind of escape outlets, assets that are outside of the financial system like gold or Bitcoin? Do you worry about them getting potentially banned?
Yeah, look, I think we are at a point where you have to now expect extreme outcomes, right? Because the situation is extreme. And so, yeah, as a holder of gold, and to your point, who understands what happened with Executive Order 6102 and how that whole thing went down, I understand the same way that 87 taught me that the markets can lose 22% in a day. 6102 taught me that your gold can be confiscated, right? So I realized that anyone that says, "Oh, that'll never happen," well, it has, and it possibly will again. So you have to think about it, which is why when the Bitcoin guys say, "Well, they can't stop it. They'll never ban Bitcoin," is never say never. Never say never, because when we get into extreme outcome territory, which is where we are now, things will get extreme. So with gold, there are, the way I think that through is would I hold my gold in the United States? Never. I just wouldn't do that. I would be much happier holding it in a country in Asia, for example, where the affinity for gold and the cultural affinity for gold just runs that much deeper. And to outlaw the ownership of gold in India, for example, is far less feasible than it is to do it in the United States. In the United States, it's not a widely held asset. In India, most families keep their savings in gold. So to outlaw gold would be a very difficult political move to make. And also, if you're going to do that, people have to have a way to hold their savings. So you will see things happen before it gets outlawed in India, whether it's we're going to open mandatory bank accounts for everybody in India and you're all going to have a bank account, whatever it may be. They will have to put something in place before they can outlaw gold in India. So you'll be able to see those moves coming. Trying to outlaw gold, the ownership of gold in Vietnam or even Singapore, Thailand, places like that, much harder thing to do, because the man in the street has a gold coin, has his savings in gold, his family. It may not be much money, but that's how they keep their savings. So there are potential escape routes for that in terms of holding your gold overseas. There's no guarantee that you'll be safe, but it will be overseas. And you will ultimately have a tangible good that, should you wish to flout any rules that get put in place, if you want to take your gold out and store it under your bed and use it to barter with, you will have that option, right? Being a dissident as far as owning gold is different to being a Bitcoin dissident, right? Because with Bitcoin, if you control the on and off ramps and you put the right sort of border guards in place, you make it very, very difficult to transact in cryptocurrencies. And also, to your point, when you just said I wouldn't become a dissident, 97.8% of the people in the world would think exactly the same as you do. There's a law, I'm not going to break it. And so if you're told that unless you hand over your Bitcoin for a pre-agreed price, you're breaking the law, most people will do that exact thing. And they'll be pissed and they'll be upset that their utopian dream has been snatched away from them. And yes, they'll bitch and moan, but the choice between bitching and moaning and becoming a criminal is an easy choice for them to make. There will be other people who will refuse to do that, and what happens with them, I don't know. But
they end up in the Caymans.
yeah, maybe. But that's one of my big questions about Bitcoin, is that the questions that I don't have answered to my satisfaction are around and not even so much outlawing the ownership of Bitcoin, but a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of a reset of the system, in terms of the fourth turning, in terms of trying to work out how to keep the wheels on the system, necessarily involve much tighter control of the currency by the government, right? We hear this talk about digital currencies. They're absolutely in our future. There's no doubt about that. And so, for me, the big question about Bitcoin is why would the government allow any kind of competing currency? Right? They never have in history. Whoever has the power to mint the currency holds all the power, right? If you are trying to set up a system which is designed to make sure that you have control of every aspect of people's spendings, you can dock money from bank accounts to citizens who don't toe the line. You can give stimulus directly to certain bank accounts to make sure the right people get it. Why are you ever going to allow for a competing currency? It's just, I won't say it's not going to happen. It's never been allowed to happen before. And so I think that's a very real question. And it's one that I haven't had an answer to other than, oh, no, they won't do that. And that, look, for me, that's good enough for plenty of people. It's just not good enough for me. And that may be my bad. But I just don't see how it's an option to allow Bitcoin to thrive in a world where you're trying to crack down on how people use the assets they have.
Yeah. I think, not that I have an answer to that question, but I think the way that I look at this is one maxim that has stuck with me that I think is quite interesting is, when you think about kind of value versus growth investing, and there's the kind of technologists on the one hand and the value investors on the other, is that the technologists tend to generally be directionally right, but they vastly underestimate the amount of frictions that it takes to get to that end state. And I think that's the framework that I think about with Bitcoin, in that I just look at the design, how eloquent it is, how much it works. I personally think it's a big step forward in terms of governance, and I think it's more of a governance thing really even than a technology thing. Right. And for me, when I look at that, I just think this feels obvious and right. And I think that there may be huge frictions in terms of adopting it long term, because I totally agree with you. I think that the biggest impediment to potential adoption is how are governments going to react to this? And I see CBDCs as the anti-Bitcoin because they are essentially a way for central banks to disintermediate commercial banks, which is where money creation, broad money creation actually happens. Right? And there's a lot of pretty dystopian futures that you could imagine with the level of granularity of control that they would have over the money supply if that actually became the case. So I guess that I think, if I'm thinking 100 years into the future, right, this feels like the general direction that money and technology is going. But I think the frictions from here to there are generally really underexplored, and not certainly by people within the Bitcoin community. It's not given the level of scrutiny that it probably deserves.
I just think right now, there's never been a worse time to be certain about anything. And there is so much certainty in the Bitcoin community that for me that's a red flag, because there have been periods in my lifetime, my investing career, where you could have a high degree of certainty about certain things. But given what's going on, I think in anything, in any aspect of your life, you should be tempering any certainty you have and checking it religiously, because I just think this is a very uncertain world with a set of very uncertain possible outcomes, many of which are riddled with serious ramifications for a lot of people. And so to be certain about anything, particularly to be that certain about a brand new, untested currency system, asset, whatever you want to call it, I just think it's a very dangerous time to blindly believe that there is no way X, Y, or Z can happen.
I totally agree. All right, I want to give you a little bit of time actually to talk about your new media enterprise. We talked,
that makes it sound very grand. My media enterprise. Thank you.
Hey, that's what it is. It's a media enterprise. And I think I've referred a couple of times in this show to your podcast that I've clearly listened to a number of times. So tell us a little bit about the different podcasts that you host, the overall goal for the site. I'd love to learn.
I've been writing a letter for a decade now called Things That Make You Go Hum, which I've been publishing. I was publishing all the way through my days at Real Vision, and under lockdown, I literally got bored. I was sat in the house, locked down, and was talking to friends of mine about the world and trying to understand what was going on. And just thought, it might be fun to record these and just put them out there. And so I did that, and then I did a series of what I called humanars back in May of 2020, I guess. And people enjoyed those and asked me if I'd do more of those, and that kind of led to the podcast. I never really wanted to build a huge audience. I've not gone out of my way to try and do that, but what I've always been keen on is finding my audience, finding the people to whom what I do has value. That's important to me. I put my time and my life and soul into these projects, but I don't want to waste anybody's time. And there's absolutely no guarantee that what I think is important or useful or interesting resonates in the same way with other people. And so I've never gone out to try and, bang a drum and drag people into my world because I feel like what I have to say is important. I'm much more interested in listening to people than I am talking, to be honest with you. And so I started doing these podcasts as a chance to learn. And having spent best part of a year putting them together, the feedback was great. The audience was great, and very appreciative of the efforts. But again, the weird thing was I started getting people emailing me out of the blue, suggesting guests for the podcast and offering to sponsor the podcast, and it was clear to me that all the people suggesting guests would simply, they were looking at the Apple top 10 investing podcast, saw my podcast show up on it, and then sent a form letter out saying, "Hey, I think this guy would be great for your podcast." And it was very clear that looking at the profile of the guest that none of them had listened to the podcast. They had no idea what I was doing, because none of these people were even remotely appropriate. I mean, all great, smart people in their own right, but there was no way they had anything to do with the conversations I was having. And likewise, the offers of product sponsorship, which were great, and but the best one I got was some eco-friendly edible lingerie company that thought that they'd be the perfect sponsor for my audience.
That's a shoe-in for your audience,
right? Yeah, exactly.
What I know about them, yeah.
So I just thought, I don't want to do this just to build a big audience to find a sponsor, and it's just not who I am, and it never has been. And so. I thought long and hard about it, and I decided that what I was going to do was put the podcast behind a paywall, and mainly because I thought, if I do that, all the people who've been emailing telling me how valuable this podcast is to them, for $10 a month for between 2 and 4 podcasts, it's not an awful lot of money. If this thing is really valuable to you, then it has a value, and that value isn't zero. And so I thought, if I do this and nobody thinks it's worth $10, I'll just stop doing it. If it's not worth it to people, I'll just stop doing it. And that's absolutely fine by me. I'll use the time to do something else. But by doing that, and I've found myself over recent years moving very quickly away from free and back towards paid, because I went through, like everybody, I went through that period where you're paying for stuff, and then suddenly this world opens up and there's so much free content, and you get deluged with free, which is great, until you realize that by the time you get half an hour into a podcast and you realize I'm taking no value from this, that's half an hour of your life gone that you're never going to get back. And so, I've always been very happy to pay to support people whose content I find valuable. And so by finding an audience that finds value in what you do, it does several things, right? It makes sure that you're not wasting your time. It makes sure you're not wasting your audience's time. And it puts pressure on me as a content creator to come up with content that maintains a high enough bar that people don't get stale or think, this is not as good as it used to be, and I'm not going to subscribe to it anymore. So that, for me, in terms of shrinking my audience and taking the tens of thousands of people who were listening to it every week and down to 5, 6, 7, 8,000, whatever it may be, was for me a very liberating experience, because I know now that I'm talking to people who value what I do. There's a contract here that I'm going to continue to provide you with valuable content, And I have to say the response has been fantastic, and I'm glad I did it. I totally understand the people that say, well, you should be doing this for free, because I shouldn't have to pay for this stuff, and I get it. I totally get it. But at the same time, my time is valuable to me, and the older I get, the more valuable that time gets to me because I've got so much less of it. And so I just felt it was an honest transaction. I'll put my heart and soul into creating something for you that I hope you will find valuable. And if I do, then it has a value. And if it's not valuable to you, then you shouldn't pay for it. And frankly, if it's not valuable to you, I'm saving you valuable time by you not listening to it, because you can go and spend that hour doing something that is valuable to you. So that was kind of the thought process behind it. And it's I hoped I knew how it would go, but I didn't know. But I also knew that if one guy decided he was willing to pay for it, then I'm doing something completely that's wasting everybody's time, so I should stop. But the response so far has been great, and the dialogue I've had with that community becomes that much stronger, because you realise that you now have an audience of people who do value that content and do want to contribute to make it better, and are happy to criticize you where it's warranted and make suggestions on how to improve it. And I just think that makes it a better proposition for everybody.
Yeah. Well, you're talking to someone that has 2 subscriptions that they pay for. One is Spotify, and the other is Grant Williams.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. And I'll thank you on behalf of Spotify too.
Exactly. Grant, this has been just a ton of fun. If people want to figure out more about you, listen to your stuff, potentially subscribe, what's the best way for them?
Sure, easiest way, it's all in one place now, which is www.grant-williams.com. And the only social media I use is Twitter. You'll find me on there at TTMYGH. And that's it. Nice and simple.
Awesome. Grant, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for making the time.
Michael, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.